Let's look at this, the medical account. Let's read along together. Pancho, pay close attention. In this paper, I shall discuss some of the physical aspects of the passion or suffering of Jesus Christ. We shall follow him from Gethsemane through his trial, his scourging, his path along the Via Dolorosa to his last dying hours on the cross. This led me first to study the practice of crucifixion itself. That is, torture and execution by fixation to a cross. Apparently, the first known practice of crucifixion was by the Persians. Alexander and his generals brought it back from the Mediterranean world, to Egypt and to Carthage. The Romans apparently learned the practice from the Carthaginians, and, as with almost everything the Romans did, rapidly developed a very high degree of efficiency and skill at it. A number of Roman authors, Livy, Cicero, Tacitus, comment on crucifixion, and several modifications, and variations are described in the ancient literature. For instance, the upright portion of the cross, or stipes, could have cross arms, the patibulum, attached 2 or 3 feet below its top in what we commonly think of as a Latin cross. The most common form used in our Lord's Day, however, was the tau cross, shaped like our T. In this cross, the patibulum was placed in a notch at the top of the stipes. There's archaeological evidence that this was the type of cross that Jesus was crucified. So, you understand right here, Pancho, what he's talking about. You know, a lot of times the girls wear around their neck a cross that has, a little part sticking up from it right there. He's saying back at this time, probably the kind of cross that Jesus was executed on was the tau cross. Something that looked like RT, okay? Let's keep going. Without any historical biblical proof, medieval and Renaissance painters have given us our picture of Christ carrying the entire cross. But the upright post or stipes was generally fixed permanently in the ground at the site of execution. And the condemned man was forced to carry the patibulum weighing about 110 pounds from the prison to the place of execution. Is that intense, guys? Many of the painters and most of the sculptors of crucifixion also show the nails to the palms. Historical Roman accounts and experimental work have established that the nails were driven between the small bones of the wrists, the radial and the ulna, and not through the palms. Nails driven through the palms will strip out between the fingers when made to support the weight of the human body. The misconception may have come about through the misunderstanding of Jesus' words to Thomas, "Observe my hands." Anatomists, both modern and ancient, have always considered the wrist as part of the hand. A titulus or small sign stating the victim's crime was usually placed on a staff, carried at the front of the procession from the prison, and later nailed to the cross so that it extended above the head. This sign with the staff nailed to the top of the cross would have given it somewhat the characteristic form of the Latin cross. So, Jesus' crimes were put on a sign that did extend up from the central piece. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there was kind of a cross-looking situation. But of course, the physical passion of the Christ began in Gethsemane. Of the many aspects of this initial suffering, the one of greatest physiological interest is the bloody sweat. It's interesting that St. Luke, the physician, is the only one to mention this. He says, "And being in agony, he prayed the longer. And his sweat became as drops of blood trickling down on the ground." Every ruse or trick imaginable has been used by modern scholars to explain away this deception, apparently under the mistaken impression that just doesn't happen. A great deal of effort could have been saved had the doubters consulted the medical literature. Though very rare, the phenomena of hematidrosis, or bloody sweat, is well documented. Under great emotional stress of the kind our Lord suffered, tiny capillaries in the sweat glands can break, thus mixing blood with sweat. This process might well have produced marked weakness and possible shock. Is that intense, guys? It is kind of cool that it's the doctor that notes that. Yeah. After the arrest in the middle of the night, Jesus was next brought before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas, the high priest. It is here that the first physical trauma was inflicted. The soldiers struck Jesus across the face for remaining silent when questioned by Caiaphas. The palace guards then blindfolded him and mockingly taunted him to identify them as he passed by. They spat upon him and struck him in the face. In the early morning, battered and bruised, dehydrated, and exhausted from a sleepless night, Jesus is taken across the praetorium of the Fortress Antonia, the seat of the governor and procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. You're, of course, familiar with Pilate's action in attempting to pass responsibility to Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Judea. Jesus apparently suffered no physical mistreatment at the hands of Herod and was returned to Pilate. It was then, in response to the cries of the mob, that Pilate ordered Barabbas released and condemned Jesus to scourging and crucifixion. There's much disagreement among the authorities about the usual scourging as a prelude to crucifixion. Most Roman writers from this period do not associate the two. Many scholars believe that Pilate originally ordered Jesus scourged as his full punishment, and that the death sentence by crucifixion came only in response to the taunt by the mob that the procreator was not properly defending Caesar against the pretender who allegedly claimed to be the king of the Jews. Preparations for the scourging were carried out when the prisoner was stripped of his clothing and his hands tied to a post above his head. It's doubtful the Romans would have made any attempt to follow the Jewish law in this matter, but the Jews had an ancient law prohibiting more than 40 lashes. The Roman legionnaire steps forward with the flagum, or flagellum, in his hand. It is a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with 2 small balls of lead attached near the ends of each. The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across Jesus' shoulders, backs, and legs. At first, the thongs cut to the skin only. Then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels in the underlying muscles. Now, you know, one of the critiques of Mel Gibson's The Passion was that it was, quote, too graphic. Let me tell you something. That's how it was. And we need to see this is what he physically went through for us. The small balls of lead first produced large, deep bruises, which were broken open by subsequent blows. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons. Is that intense? And the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue. When it is determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is finally stopped. The half-fainting Jesus is then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement, wet in his own blood. The Roman soldiers see a great joke in this provincial Jew claiming to be a king. They throw a robe across his soldiers and place a stick in his hand for a scepter. They still need a crown to make their travesty complete. Flexible branches covered with long thorns, commonly used in bundles of firewood, are plaited into the shape of a crown, and this is pressed into a scalp. Again, there's copious bleeding, the scalp being one of the most vascular areas of the body. After mocking him and striking him across the face, the soldiers take the stick from his hand and strike him across the head, driving the thorns deeper into his scalp. Finally, they tire of this sadistic sport, and the robe is torn from his back. Already having adhered to the clots of blood and serum in the wounds, its removal causes excruciating pain, just as in the careless removal of a surgical band-aid. And almost as though he were again being whipped, the wounds were once more beginning to bleed. In deference to Jewish custom, the Romans return his garments. The heavy patibulum of the cross is tied across his shoulders, and the procession of the Deum Trice, 2 thieves, and the execution detail of Roman soldiers, headed by the centurion, begins its slow journey along the Via Dolorosa. Now, Via Dolorosa just means, in Latin, the way of sadness. In spite of his efforts to walk erect, the weight of the heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by copious blood loss, is too much. He stumbles and falls. The rough wood of the beam gorges into the lacerated skin and muscles of the shoulders. He tries to rise, but human muscles have been pushed beyond their endurance. The centurion, anxious to get on with the crucifixion, selects a stalwart North African onlooker, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. Jesus follows, still bleeding and sweating the cold, clammy sweat of shock, until the 650-yard journey from the fortress Antonia to Golgotha is finally completed. Jesus offered wine mixed with myrrh, a mild analgesic mixture. He refuses to drink. Simon is ordered to place the patibulum on the ground, and Jesus quickly throws him backwards with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire feels for the depression at the front of his wrist. He drives a heavy, square, wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly, he moves to the other side and repeats the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some flexation and movement. The patibulum is then lifted in place at the top of the stipes, and the titulus reading, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is nailed in place. The left foot is now pressed backwards against the right foot, and with both feet extended, toes down, a nail is driven through the arch of each, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim's now crucified. As he slowly sags down with more weight on the nails and the wrists, excruciating pain shoots along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrists are putting pressure on the median nerves. As he pushes himself upward to avoid this stretching torment, he places his full weight on the nail through his feet. Again, there's a searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of the feet. At this point, as the arms fatigue, great waves of cramps sweep across the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps come the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by his arms, the pectoral muscles are paralyzed, and the intercostal muscles are unable to act. Air can be drawn into the lungs, but cannot be exhaled. Jesus fights to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, he is able to push himself upward to exhale and bring in the life-giving oxygen. It was undoubtedly during these periods that he uttered the 7 short sentences recorded. You get this, guys? See, basically what happens, he's on the cross, and they put it so that there's some flexation there to make the torture last longer. So he pushes up so his chest can expand, and then he goes back down. But, in sagging down, this hurts, and pushing up, he's got the pain in the feet. I mean, it's just an excruciating, painful process. The first, looking down the Roman soldiers, throwing dice for a seamless garment. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The second, to the penitent thief, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. The third, looking down at the terrified, grief-stricken adolescent John, the beloved apostle, he said, behold thy mother. And then look into his mother, Mary. Woman, behold thy son. The fourth cries from the beginning of the 22nd Psalm, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Hours of limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rendering cramps, intermediate partial asphyxiation, searing pain where tissue is torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against the rough timber. Then another agony begins. A terrible, crushing pain deep in the chest as the pericardium slowly fills with serum and begins to compress the heart. One remembers again the 22nd Psalm, the 14th verse. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. It's now almost over. The loss of tissue fluids have reached a critical level. The compressed heart is struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood into the tissue. The tortured lungs are making a frantic effort to gasp in small gulps of air. The markedly dehydrated tissue send their flood of stimuli to the brain. Jesus gasps his fifth cry, I thirst. One remembers another verse from the prophetic 22nd Psalm. My strength is dried up like potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death. A sponge soaked in porska, the cheap sour wine, which is the staple drink of the Roman legionnaires, is lifted to his lips. He apparently doesn't take any liquid. Okay, now the whole idea right here is the idea of wine or liquor trying to make the pain less. And Jesus wasn't about to let the pain be less. He apparently doesn't take any liquid. The body of Jesus is now an extremis, and he can feel the chill of death creeping through his tissues. This realization brings out his 6 words, possibly little more than a tortured whisper. It is finished. His mission of atonement has completed. Finally, he can allow his body to die. With one last surge of strength, he once again presses his torn feet against the nail, straightens his leg, takes a deeper breath, and utters his 7th and last cry, Father! Into your hands I commit my spirit. The rest you know. In order that the Sabbath not be profaned, the Jews asked that the condemned men be dispatched and removed from the crosses. The common method of ending a crucifixion was by crucifracture, the breaking of the bones of the leg. This prevented the victim from pushing himself upward. Thus, the tension could not be relieved from the muscles of the chest, and rapid suffocation occurred. The legs of the 2 thieves were broken, but when the soldiers came to Jesus, they saw that this was unnecessary. You got to make sure. You got to understand. One of the prophecies was not one bone will be broken. Wow. Apparently, to make doubly sure of death, the legionnaire drove his lance to the 5th inner space between the ribs, upward through the pericardium and into the heart. The 34th verse of the 19th chapter of the Gospel, according to St. John, reports, and immediately there came out blood and water. That is, there was an escape. That is, there was an escape of water fluid from the sac surrounding the heart, giving a post-mortem evidence that our Lord died, not the usual crucifixion, death by suffocation, but by heart failure due to shock and constriction of the heart by fluid in the pericardium. Thus, we have our glimpse, including the medical evidence, of that epitome of evil which man has exhibited towards man and towards God. It's been a terrible sight, and more than enough to leave us despondent and depressed. How grateful we can be that we have the great sequel in the infinite mercy of God towards man, at once the miracle of atonement and the expectation of the triumphant Easter morning. And the church said, Amen.